What is up, party people? I am your host, Lexi Inks, and welcome to Lex Be Real, a sex and dating podcast all about the 3 R's: real, relatable relationships. I am so excited for this episode. It is incredibly exciting and super important today, so I'm not going to take up too much time on this intro. We are chatting all things abortion, access, and reproductive care in the Trump era, which, as we know, is ever changing and ebbing and flowing constantly, and things are very confusing right now. The landscape is very unstable for a lot of people and inaccessible. So we are definitely going to talk all things about resources and access, and we talked a lot about availability versus accessibility, which was something that really reframed a lot in my head, and I learned a lot from these two experts. They are two incredibly accomplished women at Power to Decide, which is an abortion organization that provides advocacy, awareness, information, resources. Like, I cannot say enough about these people. They are such an incredible group of people who really are just such huge advocates and who have done so much work in this space. So it's incredibly important. I hope you stick around for the interview. And yeah, without further ado, let's get a few housekeeping things in order, and then let's just jump right in. So remember to follow me at Lexi Inks on Instagram, at Lexi Inks on TikTok, and that's where I post all the information and upcoming episode clips on both my Instagram and my TikTok. My website is lexiinks.com if you want any other information about my offerings or me and what I do and why I do it. And you can also follow my Substack, which has just launched its paid tier for more reported deep dives, like my journalistic writing and lots of educational, like service articles, things like that, that I don't necessarily publish on my free tier. That is Southern Jezebel. So southernjezebel.substack.com. So if you want updates on the podcast, or if you want to check out more of my sex ed and wellness content, follow my Instagram, follow my TikTok. You can subscribe on Substack, whether free or paid. And yeah, check out my website for any further details. And without further ado, let's get into the interview. So today I am so excited to have two incredibly special guests for this episode. We are talking about all things abortion care, reproductive care, and access in the Trump era, which, as most of us know, has changed a lot in the past few years and is a really important topic that a lot of people need to understand. We need to get more accurate information out there, and definitely resources that people can use. So today I'm so excited to introduce two very important people from Power to Decide, which is an incredible organization that works to provide information, education, advocacy, all about abortion care and reproductive rights access. So I'm going to start off first with Jolie Pritzker. Jolie Pritzker is a family nurse practitioner, and she spent her career talking all about sex and birth control, abortion, reproductive health. She's worked at different organizations like Planned Parenthood and various community health centers, and now she is the Senior Director of Healthcare at Power to Decide, which also, fun fact, is the organization that created abortionfinder.org and Bedsider, which are two of their kind of arms that provide those resources and access and education about reproductive health. And Jolie is also a contributing author to Contraceptive Technology. And she still finds time, I don't know how, but she's a superwoman apparently. She still finds time to see patients at a community clinic. So I'm so excited to have you here, Jolie. And I also need to introduce Monica Edwards. Monica Edwards is at Power to Decide the Senior Manager of Public Policy, and she has so much extensive experience with policy related to the federal work, related to state level work, all about reproductive justice. She has served as an If, When, How lawyering for reproductive justice, federal reproductive justice fellow, and she's worked at URGE, the Unite for Reproductive and Gender Equity, as the federal policy manager. And she's done so much work in this important space of reproductive justice. She also has spent time at In Our Own Voice, the National Black Women's Reproductive Justice Agenda. She's also served on the board of the Yellowhammer Fund. And I am so excited to introduce both of these incredible people. They are such forces in the world of reproductive justice and access. So, without further ado, I'm going to start with Jolie. Can you give us a little bit of just an intro of like what inspired you to start working in this space and what is the most important thing that you would want people to know about reproductive justice and access?
Thanks so much for having us. Excited to talk with you today. And I got started in the field of sexual and reproductive health as a health educator right out of college. I worked at a teen clinic where I did birth control counseling and pregnancy options counseling. And being totally honest, I had no idea that I was going to wind up becoming a healthcare provider. That was not on my radar at all. But I just loved talking with people about these kind of sensitive topics and like creating a space where people felt comfortable talking with me. And I worked with some amazing healthcare providers there, specifically nurse practitioners, and was like, hey, like this is something that I think I'd be interested in doing. And so that was the beginning of my journey. And now I am really excited. For the last year, I've been with Power to Decide. And part of what really inspired me to join the organization was that I think that increasingly access to information that people can make the best choices kind of for themselves about their bodies, about their lives is critically important. And especially with all the changes and all the uncertainty that's out there right now, it's increasingly important for people to have access to websites, to digital resources that help them get what they need for themselves.
Absolutely. I could not agree more. And I mean, that's incredible that in the past year you've done so much with Power to Decide. And even in the past year, things have changed still from 2022 in the post-Roe world. Like things are constantly changing and shifting. So thank you for the work that you do. And I'm so excited to chat with you today, as well as Monica Edwards. So I'm going to pass the baton to Monica and get you to kind of into the same thing. What kind of inspired you to get into this space and do all of the work that you've already done? And what's like kind of the most important thing you want people to know?
Yeah, I actually hilariously got into this space on accident. So I was graduating from law school and I needed a job, to be honest. And my mentor and professor, Richard Delgado, was just like, "Hey, I think you'd be really good for this like fellowship." And I was like, "Okay, cool." And so I did it, which is the If When How Lawyering for Reproductive Justice Fellowship, and it places you or can place you in either a federal organization that does policy work or a state organization. And so that's where I got placed at Urge and then ended up spending a lot of time at Urge. We love Urge. And so it was through the fellowship that I realized that, like, oh, wait, no, I think I want to do this full time. I get to talk about like abortion and contraception and like why people deserve access to reproductive health rights and justice all day. Sign me up. And so that's kind of how I ended up in this space. And I think just meeting a lot of great people along the way and working at a lot of great organizations like the ones you mentioned. It's really what has kept me in this space. Um, and something I think I want people to know, the landscape continues to shift every day, really every minute at this point. But to just know that to continue fighting and that like all people need and deserve access to health and information and care. And so similar to what Jolie said, one of the reasons, I enjoy working at Power to Decide is because I think information is an aspect of health rights and justice that people don't talk about as much, right? Like you can't even get to the care aspect if you don't have the information to get there. And so definitely something that I think is important that people should keep in mind.
Yes, definitely. And correct information, especially when it comes to like the work that, Power to Decide does at Bedsider too. I follow them on all their social media. And now I've kind of connected with like a lot of people that work with your social media. And it is kind of insane, the misinformation, not just about abortion, which is a whole other episode in itself of like misinformation and lack of true understanding of like what it is and the options and what it does, medically and otherwise. But even just birth control at a basic level, like the amount of misinformation that is out there about contraception is staggering. And it just continues to get worse in some ways, with I think this kind of wave of wellness influencer culture, in my opinion, which I'm sure you both can speak to. So I'm really, really excited to have you guys here because that in itself as a basic level is like kind of step one. And then it gets just, I think, even more of a bigger issue in the abortion sense as well. So yeah, information and access is key.
When I will say that that since joining Power to Decide, even in, in this relatively short amount of time, the amount that we are focusing on misinformation in digital spaces, in the policy spaces, because it is just so pervasive everywhere. And thinking about like how do people want to be getting their information? What are things that help correct misinformation in ways that still center people's personal experiences? Because yeah, it's a huge thing right now in our field.
Yeah. Oh, 100%. And that's like so incredibly important because I think when people have these kind of misconceptions and myths about these topics, they lose their access in a sense. Information can kind of equal access in a lot of ways. So bringing us back to kind of when things started changing in that aspect, what are from both of you, what some of the most impactful, like notable changes that have been made in the reproductive space since Roe v. Wade was overturned in 2022?
Happy to start. Definitely on the policy front, there's been a lot of changes both at this local, state, and federal levels. We know since Roe was overturned in 2022, and first we had the leak decision, and then we eventually had the actual Dobbs decision that came down. Since that happened, we have had essentially like a patchwork of access across the country where essentially depending on what your zip code is, whether or not you have insurance, whether or not you have providers in your area, even if you do have insurance, that really is a determining factor in addition to the policy in your state of whether or not you can get care, or even if you can get care, whether or not you have to jump through a million hurdles just to get the care that you need. As of today, there are like no clinics providing abortion in 14 states across the country. So that reflects like 13 states that have total bans on the books. And then it also reflects states that just don't have providers that are able to provide the care to people who need access to abortion. So I would definitely say since Roe, we have seen a lot of states rush to make abortion access harder, and even to the point now where states are starting to target access to contraception and push a lot of misinformation and disinformation about contraception. And so I think really one of the most impactful changes has been the fact that like because these laws on the policy front is changing so rapidly, like literally every day, people are pretty much confused, right? And I will say, like, just navigating care in America is hard in general, and imagine trying to navigate it when you have, like, all these states that are doing different things to make access to care harder. So I definitely would say, at least on the policy front, that has been really impactful for whether or not people are able to get care, which is why I think things like, obviously, Abortion Finder is helpful, right? Because we're able to sort of work to bridge the gap so that people can go to Abortion Finder, put in their zip code and their state and figure out like, can I get care in my area? Like, are there like practical support organizations that can help me get care? Are there abortion funds in the area or nearby, right? And so I think that's one of the ways that we as an organization have tried to work to bridge the gap. But unfortunately, Roe being overturned and really the domino effect that followed has impacted people's ability to get care. So
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah.
Well, and that was building on the significant barriers that existed even before kind of Roe fell. That it had those barriers existed, and so they weren't new, but they were amplified, and they were, as Monica pointed out, they're constantly changing. And so, before it was a little bit more static. That there were these access issues that existed, but we kind of knew what the playing field was. And then with everything that has sort of gone down, since the 2022 decision, it's just, this constantly evolving space that makes it harder for people to know, okay, like what can I actually access or where can I go for care because clinics are closing, and all of those different elements of it. And we also know that these barriers to care disproportionately affect young people, which is, a focus of our work at Power to Decide, people of color, folks in rural areas, sort of that there's also just a disproportionate impact.
Yes, definitely. Oh yeah, and we'll touch on especially access for like people of color and especially like Black women, I think are heavily impacted by a lot of this legislation and targeted. And I mean, is a better word for it, for sure. So especially going by statistics and just the legality of things that, like you said, is constantly changing. And I know that Monica, especially that you've done a lot of work in that space specifically. So we'll definitely touch on that as well, because I think that's something that a lot of people just really are not aware of the magnitude of that issue. So we'll definitely chat about that. So zooming in from now that we, kind of have an overview of things have changed since Roe in a lot of ways and are constantly changing. So since Trump took office most recently, like what are some of the ways that this administration specifically has altered reproductive health care and access?
Yeah, I think the funny thing about the Trump administrations, is that, right, the first time around, we kinda didn't know what we were gonna get, right? Like, we had inclinations,
Yeah.
of what would happen, once we knew that we would have an initial Trump administration, but, right, we really didn't there was no foundation, and I think, unfortunately, what we saw in that first administration was a lot of targeted effort to undermining access to sexual and reproductive health, things like the Title 10 rule, the domestic and global gag rules, which tries to limit counseling to folks who receive Title 10 funding. And so that happened in the first Trump administration, and that happened before Dobbs. And then now, unfortunately, the second Trump administration literally started, I think, day one, targeting access to sexual and reproductive health care. So I'm sure folks remember like the flurry of executive orders that happened like within the first, honestly, it was like hours, I think, of his
Yes.
first day. And it was like, wait, really? Which, I mean, I will say it's pretty standard when a new administration comes in, but just the types of EOs that he put out was literally just like, wait, what is happening? And so many of them, unfortunately, reaffirm the Trump administration's support of the Hyde Amendment, which we know like blocks and limits access to people who are low income, who use insurance, public insurance. And so he said that in black and white that he was an administration that like supported the Hyde Amendment. And so that happened in the executive order. And then we've also seen last year with the One Big Beautiful Bill that he championed and eventually Congress passed, right? In addition to cutting access to Medicaid for folks, like we know within that bill that eventually got passed, it specifically targeted abortion providers like Planned Parenthood. So the people that have Medicaid can't go to like a Planned Parenthood to get care, right? They can't get Medicaid funds. And so that was very targeted. And Congress pretty much said that, like when they were debating the bill on the floor and passing it, like it was very explicit that this was a provider that they were targeting. And then lastly, we saw recently with Title 10. There were a lot of things that happened with Title 10 last year and this year where like there was a withholding of funds to Title 10 clinics that was also very targeted to a lot of Planned Parenthood clinics that received Title 10 funding. And then just recently, Secretary of HHS RFK Jr. like basically doubled down that there will be a forthcoming rule on Title 10 that we assume at the bare minimum will be like the initial domestic gag rule that the first Trump administration implemented, but it could be worse. And he pretty much reconfirmed that is going to be forthcoming. And so we are going to see additional attacks on Title 10, which we know supports access to contraception and sexual and health information and care to people with low incomes. And so all that to say, since day one, the Trump administration has been targeting reproductive health care. And unfortunately, we're only going to continue to see attacks.
That's just the gift that keeps on giving, because in addition to the bans and restrictions and EOs, just yesterday, or maybe it was, I guess they actually maybe dropped it on Mother's Day, a new federal website, moms.gov, which I almost don't want to say because I don't want to drive traffic to it. But it is as wild as you think it might be. And specifically links, it says, are you looking for pregnancy care? And it specifically takes them to an an anti-abortion funded options line that pushes people towards pregnancy crisis centers. So every day is just a new gift from this administration.
Yeah. And speaking of, I think that's a really good point that you bring up. Not a good thing that they're doing that, especially with that website. But what are some of the, speaking from a more of like a medical standpoint, what are some of the things that people should look out for when it comes to like a pregnancy crisis center, like that kind of thing? I think we would be remiss to not mention that those are predatory and something to look out for, especially in this day and age. And I think they're probably going to continue to get more widespread as we move toward this kind of like right wing Christian nationalist, like pro birth culture. What are some kind of immediate red flags that people, especially people who may be seeking reproductive health care or contraceptive care, can look out for when they need to find like a resource or a community clinic and like they're trying to figure out what's real and what's not?
I think that's such a such an important sort of area to do more kind of public health education around this specifically. I mean, I think that one is helping people go to resources like Abortion Finder that are vetted and verified places for people to go if they're looking, for example, for specifically for abortion care. We also have Clinic Finder on Bedsider, which is broader, which covers, if somebody's, needing a pregnancy test or contraception or anything kind of specific, because what is so tricky about pregnancy crisis centers is that they often, set up shop next to legitimate clinics. They market themselves using a lot of the same language, like free pregnancy tests or abortion counseling or, a women's resource center, which are terms that are used for, legitimate organizations that do support people kind of around their sexual and reproductive health, around, pregnancy and parenting. So typically, if you're on a site and it is emphasizing the lack of safety around abortion, that should be a red flag for people. If it's like free pregnancy tests and did you know that abortion is really unsafe? That should kind of raise some flags if they have other negative things about abortion, birth control, or condoms, or just are kind of sex negative in general, kind of more like risk focused. And if they also have any sort of religious affiliation that's associated with it, that can often be, something that should, make people look twice before going there for care.
That's great for people to know. I think especially, when you're in that moment of, whether it's desperation or fear or just anxiety or lack of information, like in a lot of communities that we've realized that are, there's a reason behind that and there's definitely a targeted effort. I think that's important for people to know, like where to actually go. So I didn't know you had Clinic Finder, but that is an incredible resource. So I highly recommend anyone check that out because that's actually going to be like a credible source for finding what you actually need and what's actually going to be helpful, versus something that's going to kind of shame you and pressure you and corner you into a decision that you would not have otherwise made. So wow, thank you both for sharing all of that information because that's really, really important, especially in the Trump era, as we know. So on a, I guess, more helpful note, more positive note, what are the current generally available options for people in the United States in terms of abortion and reproductive care?
I can speak to the medical side, and kind of Monica, if you want to speak a little bit to the access side of things, because I think that available is different than accessible, right? And so it's important that there are things that people can technically perhaps get, but do they have the logistical support to do it? Are they aware kind of what those kind of technically available options are for them? And that again has been a reality for a long time. But really, it's important what especially when it comes to abortion care, there are two main ways that people can access abortion care. They can have a medication abortion or use the abortion pill, or they can go into a clinic for an in-clinic procedure. And whether or not, so, when we talk about, there are states that don't have a single abortion provider, what we're talking really about is that there are no providers kind of within the state that are doing in-clinic procedures or an in-clinic abortion. And there are no providers within the state that are prescribing medication abortion pills. And so, whether or not you're able to access in-clinic services in your state is really dependent sort of on the state. I get that right, Monica? I just always like to double check my my policy kind of assessment.
Yeah, for sure, for sure. It's definitely dependent upon where you are. honestly really is down to the zip code. Like on a basic level, yes, if you're in a state that's banned, like obviously accessing care, like it's not really realistic. But depending on your zip code, like for example, if you're in a rural area, you're in an area where it's hard to get somewhere, that adds another barrier to accessing care. So to Jolie's point, yes, available maybe, but accessible, like depending on where you are, not likely.
Okay.
And even if you're, the other thing I'll say is that, whether, if you're in a state where do have kind of more access, and certainly also people travel across, state lines for care as well. That's an important piece of it as well. It's also a personal decision that people have personal preferences around, like, are they interested in doing a medication abortion because they, that feels more comfortable for them to have the process mostly play out at home, versus they are wanting, they feel more comfortable going into a clinic for their care. So there's also just a personal kind of, personal preference element to the type of care that people are wanting to seek. And also just, what is potentially, accessible for folks.
Okay, great. And you actually bring up two very important things that I was going to ask about. So, number one, I don't want to forget to talk about this because I think this has become such a huge issue in the news and just affecting so many people across the country. What are, from both a policy aspect and a medical aspect, I think you both can speak to this very well. What are some of the things to know or the risks to be aware of when it comes to crossing state lines for reproductive and abortion care?
I could start with some of the state risk, or the policy high level risk. So like as Jolie said, right, a lot of people travel or will have to travel across state lines to get abortion care, due to the myriad of state bans and restrictions. And to be clear and to hammer on a point that I think Jolie made earlier about like this is definitely amplified now, but right prior to Dobbs, like there were people like who were in like abortion care or reproductive health care deserts where they had to travel, even if not across state lines, but like across the state just to get care. Like for example, I'm in Texas. It is a huge state, and even before, right, like SB8 and before the Dobbs decision, right, there were people that had to travel across state lines. Like if you're not in a big area where I am in like Houston, for example, if you're somewhere that's a little bit more remote, you still may have to travel a pretty long distance just to get care. But I think as far as like barriers, obviously it matters whether you live in a state where abortion care is banned or severely restricted. That will play a part in whether or not you do have to travel to get care. But on top of that, there are other things that I think Jolie mentioned, like if you're a young person, do you have to take time off from school, right? Like if you already have children, do you have childcare so that you can travel across state lines? Do you have a proper documentation, right? Like there are a lot of people who don't have like driver's licenses. Can you drive across the state like physically to get the care that you need? On top of that, like we've seen a lot of unfortunate amplification of targeting of immigrants and specifically people of color, to be frank. And so with that, like also comes like an aspect of like, what is your status? And like legally you can travel across state lines, but like, are there fears and concerns about you traveling across state lines? Maybe due to your status, maybe you live in a mixed status household, right? Or maybe you just have a fear of having to encounter law enforcement, right? In which we know communities of colors have always had to deal with in this country. And so I think, you know, to go back to the point of like available or accessible, right? It can be available, like legally, technically, you can travel across state lines to get care if you need it. But practically, can that happen is very much dependent on a case by case basis, unfortunately, right? Which is a part of the reason why like Abortion Finder exists and Bedsider and Empowered to Decide is to kind of help bridge that gap. But to be clear, right, like we should not have to bridge that gap, right? Because no one should have to go through all these hoops to get care. You should not have to think about like, can I actually travel across the state or will I have to like encounter law enforcement? Like, why do like that shouldn't be a concern when you're just trying to get basic health care. And so again, I go back to the like available versus accessible, but I will let Jolie chime in as well.
Well, I think, and Monica, you just said, I feel like such a great job of kind of laying out all of the kind of that policy piece of, of care. I think something that I think a lot about is that, especially something that happened post Dobbs was this acceleration of kind of medication abortion as the primary way in which people kind of, end their pregnancies. it now accounts for 6 in 10 abortions in the US. And there's also been kind of an increase in telehealth, kind of for folks to be able to access care. Where this gets interesting, right, is that sometimes then people either have something come up in their process of kind of, taking the medication at home where they do want to or feel like they need to engage with the healthcare system. And something that I think is really important for folks to know is that from a medical perspective, somebody having a pregnancy end after taking like medication abortion pills, or somebody having a pregnancy end through a spontaneous miscarriage, something that just happened, from a medical perspective, are pretty much the same thing. And so when somebody is, it's something I wish more people knew, because that is, disclosing whether or not you've taken a medication to end a pregnancy, doesn't change like how you would treat what's happening if someone's having, worried about how much bleeding they're having. And so that's just something that kind of, in thinking about, kind of what's important for people to know about how to access care, that there are things that are really important. Like we always want to be as honest as possible with our, as a healthcare provider. I want folks to be as honest with me as they can be. And sometimes there are things that are relevant for your care. Like, I don't need to know that you had a turkey sandwich yesterday, like for lunch, to kind of give you the best possible care. And when it comes to pregnancy management, whether or not, somebody's, again, has taken kind of medication abortion pills or not, doesn't necessarily impact kind of how, I would necessarily be treating them as a healthcare provider.
Okay, that's really good to know kind of the situation from both ends. And I think that a lot of people don't know that about the medical side of it. Like, I think because, again, with everything changing so rapidly, so quickly, and state laws specifically being so confusing from state to state, I think a lot of people are like, oh, if I have a miscarriage, am I going to jail? If I get a medication abortion legally, am I going to, you know what I mean? Like, am I going to be accused of something? Or is a doctor, going to be legally allowed to do XYZ if I have complications during birth, or during pregnancy and they need to perform like a medically necessary abortion? Is that even allowed anymore? Like, I think that's the difficult part, at least from kind of a third party non-expert perspective in this area, is that it's like, you read all these headlines and you hear all these stories, and you kind of just, it's so difficult for people to know, especially like in a state by state basis, what is actually allowed at this very moment. Like, what do I have? Like you said, not only what is available to me, what is accessible to me? Because even if it's legally available, that doesn't mean that your state or your area is going to make it actually accessible to you in a lot of ways. So I'm so glad you guys are bringing up all these points. And again, there's so much more we can go into about access versus availability. And I think from both a medical and a policy perspective, like it's constantly ever changing. And I think that's why these conversations also need to be ever changing, and they also need to be consistent and constant too.
I'll also add to on the like crossing state lines, another barrier to that I would say, and I really want to highlight is sorry, amplifying survivors. Right? Like we know there was research done like after Dobbs in 2022 in a lot of states where abortion is banned or it's hard to access. They actually saw an increase of reported incidents of intimate partner violence. Right. And so with that, we know that like pregnancy can be some of the most dangerous times for people who are in a situation of domestic or intimate partner violence, right? And so just imagine being someone who is going through that, navigating that while also needing access to sexual and reproductive health care. And like, if I am in an abusive relationship, how do I safely, both from a like law enforcement, legal perspective, get care, and also personally in a situation where like I am encountering violence every day or sporadically or whatever? How do I safely, as someone in this relationship, get access to care, right? How do I make an informed decision about getting abortion or not without having to face like violence and coercion from my partner, right? And that also happens not only just abortion, but just like contraception as well. Like we've seen that happen as well. So just also wanted to amplify that.
Wow.
One
Yeah.
One,
Go
Monica,
ahead.
what you just brought up made me think of a conversation that happened at a recent conference that I was at, where we were talking about how a lot of issues get covered actually in the media, and that, that there are, whether it's around kind of maternal like mortality and specifically, kind of, the inequities that exist there, whether it's about abortion access, whether it's about, kind of partner violence. Often we focus so heavily on the problem without pairing, like the coverage doesn't pair it with there being solutions, right? So for example, like if you're talking about reproductive coercion and kind of the barriers to that, are reporters are we also getting resources out there for people so it doesn't just feel hopeless? Because what can happen is that when people just read story after story, like about like, Black women dying in childbirth, it perpetuates this narrative of inevitability when it is anything but inevitable. It is a systems level issue that there are solutions for, that people can kind of learn ways to advocate for themselves too, or around like abortion, for example. There's all, so much emphasis on the restrictions, and people have still been finding ways to access care. And how do we make sure that we're not like, and that's why I so appreciate this conversation today, because it's about talking about where are these like, where are the gaps? Where are these big areas where we're really, failing kind of collectively, like as as a society around kind of supporting people in their reproductive and sexual health? And there are so many ways, both on local levels, on, broader kind of, with broader initiatives nationally, that are people doing their best to like help people still be able to access the care that they need. I want to give a quick shout out to like there's a partner organization in our space, Plan C, and when the most recent SCOTUS decision dropped, they were in all the comments reminding people that like misoprostol only medication abortion. Oh, actually, it was, sorry, not the SCOTUS decision. Monica, what court was it that put the initial
The Fifth
ban in
Circuit?
place? The Fifth Circuit. When the Fifth Circuit like decision dropped, they were in kind of all the comment section reminding people that misoprostol only telehealth, like, medication abortions will still be available. There will be no change to that. And I think that type of communication is super important so that people don't just hear, I can't get a medication abortion anymore, which was not accurate. Was that this one medication that often goes together was potentially being impacted.
Okay, yes, that brings up two great points. So number one, I'm so glad you said that, there's a lot of the reporting and information that we hear and see about abortion access and reproductive care, especially right now, it's a lot of like gloom and doom and fear. I would say sometimes even fear mongering in some of the stories that I've seen. Because, I'm my home base is Jacksonville, Florida. And there was that story that not too long ago came out about one of the women who was giving birth in Jacksonville, Florida, and was kind of like, the court decided that she was going to have a mandatory C-section. And I think a lot of like stories like that, they're reporting around. I have a couple doctor friends who I talked to about that, and they were like, well, as a doctor, like I agree with that in a lot of ways because of the safety for the mother and the baby and things like that. So there's a lot of like this reporting that kind of, I think, takes advantage of the moment that we're in, of the fear and the anxiety and like the ever shifting landscape, and kind of says like, oh, we're going to like sensationalize these stories so we can make people even more scared and then get clicks. And as a journalist, like I know that happens more often than we'd like to admit behind the scenes. And so to kind of shift the narrative, like you said, and I know that Power to Decide and Bedsider and Abortion Finder and all of the different arms of what you guys do is to provide that hope that there is going to be something available to you, and that is information that is important and powerful to know, and you can feel empowered to make these decisions yourself. That being said, can you break down for our listeners what is Power to Decide /Bedsider /Abortion Finder, and who is it for?
Yeah, I can start with Power to Decide and then kick it to Julie to talk a little bit more about Bedsider and Abortion Finder. So Power to Decide is a nonpartisan organization. So we're a 501c3 organization. And so really our work, we do a lot of policy, obviously, because I'm here, a lot of public policy work. But we also do a lot of our work through our digital properties like Bedsider and Abortion Finder to expand access to trusted information and medically accurate information, right? To the point, again, that Jolie made earlier, like it's important to have access to information that is medically accurate, evidence-based, and that really meets people where they are, and meets people so that they can, like, have the information they need to make decisions about their body, including, like, if, when, and how, they decide to become a parent, so
We're probably most well known for Bedsider, which is a website. We also have kind of social media platforms, mostly on Insta and TikTok, but I think we're on a few others too. And really, it's about kind of promoting access to trusted, resonant information about birth control and sexual health and relationship quality, because it's not just people don't use birth control in a vacuum, right? They're using it in the context of their broader lives. And it really, I think that's been a big shift for like the broader sexual and reproductive health field, that we used to be just really focused on like birth control, for example, but power to decide, we really move towards this model of reproductive well-being and recognizing that it's not just about whether someone's using contraception, it's about kind of where that fits into their kind of broader well-being. So that's kind of what we focus on Bedsider, so that people can get that trusted information, because we know when we do a lot, our research team does a lot of interviewing and surveying of young people, and that what we know is that people in general, but especially young folks, still want to get their information from healthcare providers. That even though they're getting most of their information off of social media, that they still are wanting those touch points with people who they perceive as being trusted messengers of information, and healthcare providers are one of them. So that's kind of, part of what we're doing over on Bedsider. And then Abortion Finder actually really developed kind of out of the Dobbs decision, and recognizing that there is a need for an to-date, accurate, resource for people to go to find both providers and also support resources in their state, so that they can access care that they need. And I'll give a shout out. We have some amazing digital fellows who join us every year, and they do the amazing work on both Abortion Finder and on Bedsider of calling like clinics, to make sure that our information is like, accurate, up to date, has all the things that someone might need to know to access care. So I just want to give them a little shout out, because they do, they're doing the tough work of making the calls every day, to make sure that the resources we have are the best they can be.
Yeah, that's a lot of work. So that's
Oh,
awesome
yeah.
that you have all of those resources and all of those people working together in tandem for, a really, really important goal. And now that we are, kind of talking about, again, going back to that point of availability, and it's great to have that information accessible to know what's available to you. But when we talk about access, I do think, and I'm so glad that I have both of you here to speak to this, medically, policy wise, and, Monica has a lot of deep expertise as well in this space. When we talk about access to reproductive care, contraceptive care, abortion care, what is kind of the difference for like people of color and other marginalized communities, and what do you want to say to them? Like, what can we offer them as people who advocate for this? Like, what are we, what are some ways that we can help, or people listening to this, if they want to get involved and help make that change, especially for more marginalized communities who are targeted in their access to reproductive care? What's like the situation right now from your perspective, and yeah, what can we do about it?
I would definitely say, again, to emphasize Jolie's point earlier, it's definitely the situation today is just a continuation and amplification of how things have always been, honestly, specifically for marginalized communities. Whether you're talking about women, whether you're talking about young people, whether you're talking about people with disabilities, trans folks, communities of color, specifically Black and Indigenous folks of color, right? Like access to sexual and reproductive health care, access to care, period, or even can go as far as to say access to just basic human rights in this country has always been lacking for those communities, like since the founding, and I'm doing air quotes, of this
Yeah.
country. What from obviously the history of slavery, the continuation of Jim Crow, like the sterilization of people with disabilities, the targeting of Latinas. Like I could continue and go on and on and on. Like our country has always made it a point to target communities of color. And so I think what we're seeing now again is just people starting to wake up to something that has always been there. And I think we were just seeing it amplified in this moment. And I think, again, to the point of why it's important to have things like Abortion Finder and Bedsider, like because we have social media, right, which can be a great thing. And also it can be, unfortunately, a way for a lot of mis and disinformation about abortion, contraception, sexual and reproductive health care, just the stigma of it all, like to really persist. And I think that that runs deep again in a lot of marginalized communities. And so I think now what I would say to I'll say our communities, what I would say to us is that continue fighting, right? And like we've always had to fight for things in this country, and obviously that's not fair, and we should not have to. And I do think when we really lean into frameworks like reproductive well-being and reproductive justice, right, we can get to a point where all of us have the tools and resources we need to make decisions about our bodies, about our reproductions, about our relationships in our communities. And so, unfortunately, it's a continuation of what has always been there, but right, like those are the same communities that have always fought, both for their communities and for people outside of it. And so even though it's bleak, I don't have like this like doom and gloom perspective. I think communities, whether you're part of a historically marginalized community or not, I think we help each other and we keep each other safe. And so we will continue to do that even in the like most unimaginable circumstances. And resources again like Abortion Finder and Bedsider, but also like legal organizations like If When How, RJ or it's like Sister Song, for example, Spark Reproductive Justice Now, in Georgia, Yellowhammer Fund in Alabama, right? Like these are organizations that really do focus on marginalized communities. And so in addition to like obviously getting involved and learning more about our resources at Power to Decide, I would definitely recommend like learning more and getting involved with those legal and RJ organizations. So
There's, as Monica mentioned, because this is not new, that also means that there are individuals, communities, organizations that have deep expertise in what it looks like to support people kind of in getting kind of what they need on kind of basic human rights levels. And that, I think that we sometimes like to look for the new shiny thing. But in this situation, it's good to look to the folks that have been doing this work, community organizing work, advocacy work and for a long time, and really kind of using that deep expertise to inform kind of where we go from here.
Yeah, that's really great. Yeah, and definitely, yeah, uplifting those voices as well as honoring and listening to them, because I think that there's only so much a disenfranchised community can do before they need that megaphone put to them by people of privilege like myself and so many other communities that don't experience that disenfranchisement. So I think that's a really great point. And yeah, I'm sure, especially working in community health, I'm sure Jolie, you see it as well. Like, and one thing I want to point out, especially with this current situation in sociopolitical climate and around ICE, what I'm curious, what in particular, from both a medical and a policy standpoint, is the situation with like undocumented immigrants or people in different communities, like you said, that could have like mixed status households, things like that. Like what is the situation with, or is there any availability of like resources for those people in particular that are affected by like ICE's presence across the country, essentially?
Well, on a practical level, like the clinic that I still go into and I see patients at, we had gotten a little bit stricter around telehealth, like that we wanted more people to be coming back into the clinic for lots of different reasons. But when has been as there's been the increased ICE presence, we have like shifted back and recognized that it's more important for people to be able to connect with their healthcare provider, whether that's as telehealth or in person, and that if they weren't going to be coming in person because they were worried about enforcement kind of in their neighborhood, that there was more flexibility, for example, around like kind of doing telehealth options. And what that really gets to, I think at its core, like, and I'll speak to like as a healthcare provider, is that I think that healthcare providers as individuals and certainly the healthcare kind of, systems in general can do a much better job of aligning with people instead of the systems. And so sure, from like an insurance reimbursement standpoint, it's better, quote unquote, to like have people come in person because you get paid more. But in recognizing the needs of a community, offering more flexible options for people to get a refill on their medication, because of the reality of kind of what's going on in their neighborhood, like that we as healthcare providers should be advocating for those things, because they are important for people. And the more we as kind of, again, healthcare providers can show people that we're siding with them, and not with kind of the systems that have perpetuated inequities. I think.
Yeah, and it's love all that. And as far as resources, there are like amazing organizations and advocates doing work to help people who are maybe undocumented or maybe even not undocumented, right? We've seen over the last year that like there has been a targeting specifically just to name it like people of color in particular and like regardless of immigration status or not. And so there's been a lot of organizations like ACLU, National Immigration Law Center, the National Latina Institute for Reproductive Justice, the National Asian Pacific American Women's Forum. Like there are a lot of amazing organizations, whether that be legal, whether that be RJ, that have been doing a lot of work since we've seen really amplification of like um, ICE presence in our cities that have been trying to help with to make sure people know their rights, to make sure people know right can do risk assessment, right? Because you can know your rights and try to assert them, but there can be risks that comes with that. And so there have been like organizations doing work to train people on de-escalation and things like that. And so I just think in this moment, like it's, at the end of the day, it's a system. And so, right, that's going to take a while to really dismantle. But in the meantime, there are a lot of organizations that are doing work to try to kind of help folks, know their rights and access care when they need it.
Great. And that's both, all of those are amazing names to shout out. And again, we're all going to collectively work together to get the links in the show notes to everything that we've mentioned so that we can have everybody, point everybody in the right direction for anything that they might need or want to support. But speaking of supporting, because like you're saying, it's so important to try to contribute in any way we can to any of these efforts. I know I definitely want to, I have a Planned Parenthood in my hometown and I'm like, I want to like volunteer and I want to donate and do whatever I can to help. And even then more grassroots organizations that are like local on the local level, there's definitely efforts everywhere. I think you just have to look for them and put in a little bit of work. So speaking of that work, for everybody listening, what are some practical ways, whether, along the spectrum of like quick and easy to taking a lot of time and effort, for people to donate, to support, to get actively involved and advocate for reproductive health care and justice, especially for those who really need it, those disenfranchised communities?
I'll start with an easy one. And Monica feels free, I'll give you I'll give you the harder one. But I think that sharing, I mean, this is really kind of really basic but important, like sharing trusted resources. Like if you are on and engaging with trusted resources and liking kind of videos that like people who maybe you follow are, when they're sharing good information, or if there are content creators that are reflective kind of their own community and are sharing resonant resources. We at Power to Decide do, we have an initiative called Beyond the Sheets, which works with HBCUs, both on campus, but they also have like a social media presence. And I think that the more we can kind of in this algorithmic soup that exists, the more that we can, again, thinking about uplifting those voices so that they have more of a presence in that space. I think that's something, it's a relatively small lift, but I think it's a small thing that people can do.
Plus one to that, I was literally gonna unmute and be like, and share trusted information, like piss better. Yeah, I mean, just to hammer down the point, I think it's really important again when we live in this unfortunate moment of a lot of mis and disinformation about contraception, about abortion, about like sexual health in general, right? Like, I think we kind of can minimize the impact of that. And like, not only does it like perpetuate mis and disinformation, but it contributes to stigma, contributes to shame, it contributes to eventually policy, and then policy impacts people and how they're able to make decisions or not. And so just plus wanting that, sharing resources, right? Sharing resources like Bedsider, Abortion Finder, Plan C, and also like, right, like volunteering, to your earlier point, volunteering at abortion clinics, not just Planned Parenthoods, but also indie clinics, right? They need a lot of support, and obviously a lot of times don't have the funding and the staff support that a lot of other providers do. And so donating to those organizations, volunteering if you can with those organizations, donating to Power to Decide, donating to RJ orgs. Have to shout out, like, as someone on the board of an abortion fund, like, please donate to abortion funds. Like, those are the organizations that, like, in practice, if someone needs an abortion and doesn't have the money for it, oftentimes is the bridge of helping that person get care. And so just some high
When there
level.
Yeah, and there was a
Sorry?
big, no, I was gonna say, like, there was, right after the Dobbs decision, a lot of money poured into the abortion funds.
Mhm.
Now it's not quite as top of mind for people, but there is still a huge need, kind of, and will continue to be a huge need for people who have to travel for care. And so, yeah, definitely that's a very, and that can be really local for people. You can find kind of your local abortion fund and connect with them, and they, financial resources, volunteering, whatever it is, kind of, that works kind of for your life. But that's, can really, I think sometimes feel, when you donate to like a big national org, which you should too, you should donate to Power to Decide also. But like getting involved kind of in, smaller local organizations, you can really see the impact. And along those lines, I think that there, people, this is a bigger, I thought of a bigger one, a bigger way, there is such a need for more engagement in local politics. And I think that, there's obviously the big impact at the national level, of a Dobbs decision, but also like whether, a city council gives a permit to a clinic, like if somebody wanted to open, an abortion clinic in their area, like that is ultimately a local level issue around zoning and, all of that type of stuff. So, for people who really, want to, get super involved, get involved in your local politics.
Heavy plus sign on the getting involved.
Yeah, and I think that's such a good point, and that's so important. Like the local politics thing, I laugh because my Jacksonville friends and family know that I'm always the first one to be like texting everyone I know, everyone I have a phone number for in the area code. And I'm like, you better be voting on our next city council election. I'm like, early voting ends tomorrow. Like, I'm like, because that's where I always say, like, it's so easy in this day and age to feel hopeless about, especially like federal policy and things at such a high level, especially in something like the Trump administration. It's really, really easy to kind of let that fear mongering get to you and like let all the things that are really affecting people kind of cloud your judgment and make you feel like there is no hope. But like you said, like the best way to see physically like the fruits of your labor in terms of advocacy and like social justice is at such a micro community level, like helping your neighbors, helping your city council, like running for city council if you feel like you can, or like voting for, canvassing, like local and state level politicians, like the local, like I'm such an active voter in Florida. It's so funny. And so, like the Jacksonville Period Pantry, I'm going to shout out a couple local resources. They do such great work for like so many queer and trans people and like people who identify as women and like anyone with a period. Like they do so much work. There's so many different local grassroots organizations that provide like the morning after pill and things like that. And the Florida Access Network, they're a great. I mean, they're small, but they're mighty. And I get their emails all the time. I remember, and yeah, and I'm definitely guilty of being a person who, right at Roe v. Wade, especially being a journalist reporting on all of this. Like, yeah, I was like, let me go donate to the Florida Access Network right now. And of course, like, do I have a recurring donation going right now? No, but I should, you know what I mean? And so I think we're we all know that there are ways, if you don't have the financial resources to donate, there are so many other ways that don't cost you money, that may just cost a little bit of time or a little bit of focus or attention, or even just your algorithm, like 10 minutes of your daily doom scroll. Like, just like you said, like, go find real resources of people who are sharing important, helpful information. I think there's so many ways that we can help, and I think if we all work together to do it, I think it's gonna start making a difference, because the difference starts at the ground level. You can't build anything unless you build it from the ground up, and so I really do hope. I have to have hope. I think we all have to have hope that things are going to, they say the pendulum swings. I think eventually it'll swing the other way, and I think that we'll get there, and I'm so glad that you guys have so much hope too. And it sounds like you are aware of so many resources that obviously I think now I finally am too. So that way there are people working toward the shared goal of getting information out there and make access more accessible. So yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
And is there let me think. So is there any other like specific resources that you recommend, or like any key takeaways that if someone was listening to this and they only took away like one or two main things from this about what they have access to, what's available, what they can do, or where you see kind of the future of reproductive care going, like what would you want to say? I know that's a big question.
I think a big takeaway, I think that I would love for people to walk away with is that there are still lots of potential ways to access care. And that might look different than how you used to access care. That might look different than how you thought you might access care. But that using kind of, you know, using trusted resources, the context of abortion care, like Abortion Finder, can help connect you with what you need when you need it. Because, like you mentioned, it can seem really bleak. And we know that lots of people are still finding ways to get what they need. It's not enough, and we still have a lot of work to do. But that people are resilient and resourceful, and that, hopefully we are one like small part of a much broader ecosystem that helps connect people with what they need.
Heavy, heavy, heavy plus sign on that. I one of my favorite quotes and something I try to live by, which I mean can be hard. I am hopeful, but I mean I do have my pessimistic days. But one of the quotes I like to live by is I'm no longer accepting the things I cannot change. I'm changing the things that I cannot accept. By the amazing and visionary Angela Davis. And with that, I would say something I want people to take away is like, regardless of where you are, not only in the US, but in the world, like you are a human and you deserve human rights. Period, point blank. Full stop. Like stigma, shame, and politicians should not be in the healthcare room with you. They should not be at home with you making decisions about care or like bodily autonomy and right. And so as long as we continue to not accept the things that we don't like in this world, but continue to fight back, that is how we win. And so I feel like I'm just plussing everything Jolie just said. But I do believe we are resilient and that we can continue like hopefully getting to a world where reproductive well-being is a reality.
Even all the thumbs up to what Monica just said.
Yes, and I think, yeah, I think that's so true, and I think if there's one thing about especially women in 2026, resilience is what we have to have. And so I think anyone who's affected by this legislation at large, I think resilience and teamwork and like community is so important. So I know that this is going to be incredibly helpful for people. And yeah, where also can we find you guys specifically? Like if there's any individual or personal work that you want to shout out, or projects, or if there's like socials that you want us to follow, if people want to, follow for you for more information and advocacy, like where can we find you guys too?
I was gonna amplify it prior to the side. I was like, we are on all the we're on all the social channels, Instagram, Twitter, because I still say Twitter. I don't say X. I refuse to. TikTok, like all the things. You can find like Power to the Side, Bedside, or you can find Abortion Finder on abortionfinder.org. Like all that is available. And then I would just say personally, I mean, I'm on Twitter and Instagram if folks want to follow, and specifically want to shout out Yellowhammer Fund that I'm on the board of, and really encourage people to follow them and support their work because they're doing a lot of great work in the deep South that is definitely needed.
People can find me either, I'm going to be really boring. You can find me on LinkedIn with my name. I am largely responsible for our bedsider providers, which is our more clinical focused content. And so if you use the contact us page on there, I'll see it. So you can also kind of find me that way. If, I always love to connect with people who are kind of, deeply passionate about this work too, especially kind of the intersection of it with kind of clinical care. So, feel free to reach out that way.
Perfect. And yes, absolutely. Everybody, I will link all of the Power to Decide, Bedsider, Abortion Finder, and Clinic Finder links and everything you need to know, all those accounts and stuff in the show notes and in the description. And then again, we're going to work together to get all of the other, organizations and advocacy networks that we mentioned, because I think all of those are so important and super applicable to so many people. And yeah, I think this is really incredible. And I'm so thankful you guys took the time to chat with me and share all of this incredible information, especially in, like you said, just such a time when it's so easy to get down and really feel kind of hopeless about it. I think this is really important to make people recognize that there is hope and there's a future and we can all work towards it and get there faster. So thank you guys so much for chatting with me. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Lexi. This has been great.
Ew, this is great.
Thank you so much for tuning in. I hope you found that interview as informative and insightful as I did. And just a reminder, follow me on Instagram and TikTok at Lexi Inks, and check out my Substack, Southern Jezebel, at southernjezebel.substack.com. My website is www.lexiinks.com if you want any more information. And be sure to rate and subscribe to the podcast on any preferred platform. I'll talk to you guys later. Bye.